Antonio Vivaldi was Italy's master composer of concertos, writing more than 500 of them in his lifetime. But why did the famous 20th century Russian composer Igor Stravinsky allege, 200 years after Vivaldi's death, that Vivaldi never actually wrote 500 concertos, but wrote only one, 500 times? Perhaps no other composer for hire was more prolific than Italy's Antonio Vivaldi. He wrote more concertos than any other composer that ever lived, but is now best remembered for a set of 4 violin concertos known as the Four Seasons. Now, no one is disputing that there is a similarity to most of Vivaldi's work. But when you think about it, that's true of most composers.
The trouble with famous quips is they're sometimes funnier than they are accurate, and that certainly applies to Stravinsky's famous accusation that Vivaldi didn't write 500 concertos, he wrote one concerto 500 times. But there's a grain of truth to it, and the grain has to do with the fact that Vivaldi wrote in standard forms. And so he knew the way the piece should be written from a structural point of view and didn't really try to innovate much from that.
Well, I think that probably reflects not Stravinsky's ignorance about Vivaldi, but more the way people used to play his concertos. They used to play them all the same way. They didn't get it. Vivaldi is, and so I think that probably that speaks to bad performances of Vivaldi that Stravinsky had heard.
In the 18th century, most reputable composers were employed by either the church or by nobility. They were often treated like servants and were expected to churn out compositions on command for any event, like royal visits, weddings, and even birthdays. Not only did this place a great creative burden upon their shoulders, wearing out quill after quill to better their last effort, it also created a colossal body of work.
In those days, a composer was a craftsman, and he wrote as a craftsman for the institution which employed him. It was as simple as that, a very basic employer-employee relationship with a certain amount of prestige attached.
Vivaldi lived in the Baroque era, an era characterized by complex harmonies and emotional depth in form and feeling. But perhaps the best way to get a sense of this period is not only to listen, but to look.
You could call it an era of wonderful excess. And I think that it's an era in which the art was directed more toward an aristocratic public than it was to, in the 19th century, a bourgeois public, if I may use those old terms. It was an era that loved striking contrast, too. And when you listen to Baroque music, there wasn't a great deal of subtlety, there was a great deal of elaboration.
Improvisation was another trait common in the Baroque period. Composers like Vivaldi were expected to be able to improvise melodies on the spot, just as jazz musicians do today.
For example, Vivaldi's Four Seasons, the slow movement of spring. Let me just play you the opening of it. That's what Vivaldi wrote. And a modern player will play that, but probably a little more sustained with a modern violin. But a Baroque violinist will probably add some ornaments. That kind of a thing. And that's what they did. They added ornaments. Every performance would be different. In that way, it's closer to jazz than it is to classical music, as we think of it.
Antonio Vivaldi was born in Venice, Italy in 1678. He was the son of a barber who was an incredible violinist in his own right. At the age of 14, the young Vivaldi was enrolled into the Catholic priesthood against his own will. Since his family was relatively poor, the church was a means to obtain a free education. But more importantly for Vivaldi, it was an opportunity to flourish as a musician within the church's large musical establishment. After 10 years of intense study, Antonio Vivaldi was ordained a priest.
Oh, he was quite admired, and the fact that he had a red beard, and they called him the Red Priest, added a drama to his presence. So there was no question about it, the idea that this priest was also a musician and a composer. He was quite a special person.
Vivaldi wasn't a priest for long, though. Once, while in the middle of performing Mass, he left the altar to jot down a tune that happened to pop into his head, leaving the congregation stunned. A church tribunal decided that he would never be allowed to perform Mass again, which was perfectly fine by him. Fortunately for classical music, Vivaldi was more interested in stirring the soul with music than saving it.
I think Vivaldi was one of the first composers to go, at his time, to go beyond the idea of church music. Vivaldi wrote many, many concertos, especially for violin, and not all of his music was church-based, such as masses, that type of thing. He went beyond that, started to write a lot of secular music, and made it popular.
Vivaldi's music was reflective of classical music's evolution. He and the two other Baroque giants, Bach and Handel, were experimenting with all different kinds of musical structures and breaking the rules along the way. Vivaldi composed other works, such as operas, chamber music, and choral pieces. But as the indisputable master of the concerto, he is famous for solidifying the model that is still followed today.
Before that, it had been in more of an embryonic form. There had been concerto grossos, and there had been some concertos, but generally the idea that an instrument would take this prominent role and be featured as if it were a singer. Before, it was always singing, and then you'd have the orchestra as a backup, and you'd have somebody singing some wonderful song or an aria from an opera or from something religious, whatever. But the idea that an instrument would play that role and would sing to you and would do its virtuosic things and fast things, and it would do slow things that would move you and so on, that was fairly new, and that was something that Vivaldi definitely mastered.
If not for Vivaldi, maybe the concerto would not have developed as early. Maybe it would have taken another 20, 30s to develop.
I think he created this model because it was an interesting model for people to listen to. It was a well-designed and well-thought-out plan of making music that would be interesting and you'd never get bored by it.
Vivaldi cultivated the progressive idea that the soloist was in contest with the orchestra. He created dramatic tension by simply altering each movement's volume or speed. But Vivaldi's concerto format was based on a simple three-movement plan: fast, slow, and then fast. In 1703, Vivaldi was hired as a teacher at l'Ospedale della Pietà. Known publicly as a Venetian orphanage, it was actually a home for abandoned girls, many of whom were the offspring of rich noblemen and their mistresses. The young girls were well looked after and encouraged to either sing or take up an instrument.
These young girls produced some of the highest standard instrumental playing of their day in their community. And why not, after all? They had a lot of time to practice, and they had somebody like Vivaldi to supervise them. And so those concerts that they gave became very fashionable events for Venetian society. And it was not surprising that they prized Vivaldi's presence as somebody who brought prestige to the institution, because people wanted to hear music performed at a high level, and the girls provided it.
Vivaldi would stay connected to the orphanage for almost his entire life, and whenever he wanted to show off the musical talents of one of the girls, he would write her a concerto.
His strengths as a composer, especially in writing for the violin, was that he was a violinist. He knew what worked on the violin, he knew what was going to sound good, and he knew what was possible.
In addition to being a great composer, Vivaldi's amazing virtuosic skill as a violinist often astounded his audience. He was so talented, the Pope would invite him to his private apartment so he could hear the master play.
He was such a good violin player because there was also remarkable violins being made at that time. And all these things went together, and one pushing the other. There's this kind of dialectics between the good playing and the instruments that were made.
No other classical instrument has captured the public's imagination more than the violin. Violinists tell me that there are about 175 ways to break a violin without even really trying. It's no wonder they're so protective of these mystical instruments that are often centuries old and can cost millions of dollars.
I think the mystery of the violin is one of the most fascinating in music. The great names, Stradivarius, Guarneri, Amati, we don't know how to make instruments today that compare in greatness in terms of tone quality, projection, all the refinements of sound that they made then. And I think that that fact, the fact that we don't know how to do it in an age when we're always supposedly able to do things better than they were done in the past, has created a real mystique around great old Italian violins of the 17th and 18th century.
A mystique for me is just that these things are so old. I mean, this is, 230 years old, and it's still speaking in a way. So to me, it's kind of an actually living link to a past era. Beethoven was 9 years old when this was made. Just sort of thinking of things like that, it's like pre-Napoleonic wars, and just nobody could possibly be alive and still speaking. It's so many generations ago, and yet this is.
So when you're holding one of these violins in your hand, you sort of feel like, wow, this violin has, could have had the Brahms concerto, played on it by Joachim. There's a certain spirit or soul to famous violins.
Everybody knows the word Stradivarius or something, and not that many people know Guadagnini. To me, it's a better violin. I don't care about the name. And so it can be that, you can just find some incredibly great thing that doesn't have the name Stradivarius, necessarily. There's a whole bunch of Guarneris out there and Amatis and things that are incredible. But again, it was this sort of period of violin making that was sort of just never equaled.
Vivaldi's most popular composition for any make of violin is, of course, The Four Seasons. It remains one of the most performed and recorded classical works ever. Its infectious melodies and zesty rhythms have been used in countless films and TV commercials. Not only are these four concertos for solo violin and orchestra masterpieces, they are excellent examples of program music, music that tells a story.
He gave us sounds. He gave us truly nature sounds, which is almost like movie music. It was the first movie piece, and it's fantastic. He managed to write thunder. He managed to make us feel drowsy with the music. And there are words, he actually wrote the words into the music, that when you play this, this is what I want.
For each of the four concertos, Vivaldi wrote a poem. The poems describe his different observations about the seasons. He then translated this imagery into extraordinary music.
Everybody knows what it's like to be way too hot. And so, he really, it's like sort of, you really kind of feel sweaty even playing it. It's like...
This is just teeth chattering, I mean, if it doesn't sound exactly like teeth chattering, but if you look at the poem, hear the music, you think, it sounds like so it's very colorful in this respect. These are the kind of effects that Vivaldi used. He used, when walking on ice, these very broken up little elements. Hesitating steps and falling to the side, and it's not exactly smooth and easy walking. Vivaldi is showing us in musical sounds what we might experience in cold weather.
The reason I think that these pieces are so perennially popular is because of the programmatic nature, there is a lot of room for interpretation and individual interpretation, and so you can feel strongly about doing it one way and somebody else can feel strongly about doing it another way, and so that's what makes them so interesting all the time.
Vivaldi's beautiful, evocative music was soon forgotten after his death in 1741. The musical world was entering the classical period of more emotionally restrained music, and Vivaldi's name was barely mentioned for almost 200 years.
Vivaldi's real rediscovery came about in the 20th century in two phases, really. In the 1920s, when a lot of the music literally was rediscovered in caches, and in the 1950s, when the idea of playing early music on period instruments became really quite common and quite fashionable. And before that, he was just essentially another man in the history books.
Part of the fun that we have is finding these great composers or these unknown works by known composers that never get done, that are every bit as good as the great stuff, and bringing them to people's attention and performing them and turning people on to them.
The fortunate discovery of Vivaldi's work, which lay dormant for so many, many seasons, is one of the greatest finds ever in musical history.